I was really looking forward to Isn't It Romantic? Granted, I look forward to every Golden Girls episode, but I read the description for this on IMDb when I pulled up the episode listing, and I immediately thought this could go one of two ways. But I was hopeful, and I was right to be hopeful because it's very good. This is the 5th episode of the 2nd season of The Golden Girls. It's directed by Terry Hughes, and I will read you that one sentence from IMDb. There will, of course, be spoilers in this discussion from now as I talk about what happens in this episode and share some thoughts. And this sentence is, Dorothy's lesbian friend Jean develops a crush on Rose. It definitely sounded like it could have gone either way, but Golden Girls has a history, at least up until this point in the show. I haven't seen any episodes after this yet. They have a history of tackling topics that, in the wrong hands, could be done very badly, very insensitively, but I found that they've actually done wonders with them, particularly for the time in the 1980s. The show seemed to be decades ahead of its time. And that's definitely the case here as well. So I'll go through things chronologically and share some thoughts along the way. It starts off with Sophia watching a dirty film, and they all come into the room one by one. Dorothy comes in, and then Blanche and Rose come in, and they pass some comments on this, and Sophia is just an absolute delight. We then find out that Dorothy's friend Jean is coming over to stay, and a year ago she lost her partner Pat. So it might be quite a sensitive time. Dorothy worries, though, that Jean won't get along with Blanche and Rose. And in a moment where it's just Dorothy and Sophia, we learn that Jean is actually gay. And I don't think they ever used the word gay throughout this. I think they used the word lesbian. I don't know if the term gay also referred to lesbians in the 80s. If anybody knows anything about that, please feel free to let me know. But if I use the terms gay or lesbian throughout, please forgive my inconsistency. I'm going by what I've written in my notes. And Sophia had this, there are quite a few quotes in this. I wrote down a couple of them, not too many, but definitely Sophia had some of the most beautiful lines in this. And she said, frankly, I'd rather live with a lesbian than a cat, unless the lesbian sheds, which I love. But also, I love cats, so I don't completely love her sentiment. What's she got against cats? It's obviously not the main focus. Jean then comes over. She's played by Lois Nettleton. She's a really likeable character, and I loved how Dorothy handled this, because she asks Jean how open she is with being a lesbian. She mentioned that she hadn't told Rose and Blanche yet, because she wasn't sure if it was something that she was out in the open with, or if it was something that she only told people once she felt comfortable with them. And I think that's completely the right way to handle the situation. However, she also had to mention that she obviously hadn't told them that Pat, Jean's former partner, was a woman. And I feel like that's quite significant, because it means that if Pat does come up in conversation, either they're going to have to be careful with how they refer to Pat, or not mention Pat at all. And I think Dorothy had the right approach of just saying, look, this is the situation, I'll follow your lead. And then Rose comes in with some ice cream clowns with sugar hats, which is one of the cutest things Rose has ever done. And I love this scene, because we have a lot of conversation between the girls, and a lot of the comments seem like they could potentially be a slip-up with regards to Jean being gay. And meanwhile, Sophia's just there eating her ice cream clown with its sugar hat, and it's just adorable. And then she piped up at one point saying, you don't know the half of it, and then carried on eating her ice cream. It was just so adorable. A little while later, we're in the kitchen, and they're talking about men. Mostly Blanche keeps bringing the topic up of men, but I think that's not necessarily a surprise. And we have one of the best facial expressions ever. Rose says, in agreement with the fact that Pat had, passed away a year ago, and Jean was still not over that. I don't know if over that is the right phrase to use, but it's something that Jean was still dealing with, and Blanche is baffled by this. But Rose says, in support of Jean, I couldn't even think of another man for years after my husband died. Blanche turns around and looks at her in the face and says, that's why you have bad muscle tone. And Rose's facial expression, she doesn't say anything. She doesn't reply with words, but the reply in her facial expression is absolutely fantastic. But then Rose gets excited because she finds out that Jean was also raised on a dairy farm, and Rose asks Dorothy, why didn't you tell me this? And Dorothy says, because I wasn't sure if you'd be able to handle the excitement. And that's a very good point, because I don't think Rose has ever been quite this giddy. It was an absolute joy to see. And then Rose and Jean spend some time together. They're going to lunch, they go to a matinee, and then they come back one day, and when Jean is alone with Dorothy, she tells her she needs to go home. And we learn that this is because she thinks she's falling in love with Rose. And I think her decision to leave the situation before her feelings became more severe was a sensible one. I don't think it was kind of her running away from the situation. I genuinely believe she'd assessed the situation and realised it would be the best thing for everybody. And not that I'd want her to leave, but I can completely understand why she was saying that. We then have a rather brilliant scene that night in bed with Sophia and Dorothy. It's not the first time we've seen them sharing a bed, and it's always just so, so sweet. And eventually Dorothy reveals to Sophia that Jean thinks she's in love with Rose, and Sophia's response is just absolutely brilliant. But Sophia is so fantastic in this, because Dorothy asked her, what would you do if one of your children was gay? And Sophia said she'd love them the same. And it's just, even for the 1980s, that instant, I wouldn't treat them any differently response is really fantastic. And to see that from Sophia as well is just absolutely wonderful. I know she's a fictitious character, but if a character who's meant to be quite elderly in the 80s could have that attitude, then what excuse does the older generation of today have for potentially not feeling that way? I'm generalising. I still think attitudes are changing, but at the same time, even though she's fictitious, here is a display of the fact that a character of older age in the 80s could be perfectly fine with it, because that's the right way to be, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. Blanche then comes in, and they explain to Blanche that Jean is a lesbian, and Blanche's response is unexpected, partly because she didn't grasp lesbian immediately. And what's really interesting watching this now is that I'm starting to realise, and this is just not something I'd ever thought about before, but Blanche had to think about what that word meant. It took her a couple of seconds to grasp what the word lesbian meant. Whereas now, if you say it, I imagine pretty much everybody, at least every adult, is going to know what the word means. And that's really, really interesting. And we come back to this a little later with Rose as well. But Blanche's response was very funny. I think the best part is that Blanche just couldn't believe Jean would choose Rose over her, which I thought was just very typical of Blanche, and a very believable response that I think was handled very well. And then we have a delightful scene where it's delightful but also slightly tense, because Rose and Jean are alone playing cards. Rose is wearing the most adorable jumper with teddy bears on it. It is the cutest thing ever. And I kind of felt like something was going to happen. And I was waiting, not necessarily for Jean to make a move, but I was really worried that she'd say something that would make Rose uncomfortable. I wasn't sure how she was going to handle this situation. And they end up staying up until 2 o'clock in the morning. So instead of waking up Dorothy, Rose suggests that Jean sleeps in her bed with her. And Jean agrees. And I don't necessarily know if I agree with what Jean says next, because I don't think it was necessarily the right thing to say. But also, if you don't take a leap, how can you ever succeed in life? So I'm kind of torn with how I feel about this. But while Rose is lying in bed, she's half asleep, not really paying attention, and she's telling Rose that she's very fond of her. And then the penny drops, and Rose has this look of, I want to say, panic on her face, and the only thing she knows how to do in that moment is to pretend to snore, to pretend to be asleep. And Jean, to her credit, decides to take the blanket over to the sofa that's on the other side of the room rather than getting into the bed with Rose. I think at that point that would have made Rose really uncomfortable, and I think that was definitely the right thing to do. And then we have a conversation the following morning between Jean and Rose that kind of clears the air a little bit. And actually, before that, Rose actually approaches Dorothy and says she knows that Jean is gay. What should she do? She's been told that she has these feelings, or at least kind of suggested this. And she asks Dorothy why she didn't tell her. And Dorothy says to Rose, I don't even know if you'd know what a lesbian was. And that's another thing that kind of made me realise that that term might not have been as common then as I said it is now. So that was really fascinating. But Rose was very respectful, and she still wanted to be Jean's friend. She didn't feel like she'd been forced to propel herself away from the situation, and I think Rose handled it very, very well. And then we end with a delightful bit from Sophia, where Rose and Jean have a lovely hug and everything's really nice, and then Sophia comes in and she says she'd been listening at the door, and Rose asks her, why were you listening at the door? And Sophia replies, because I'm not tall enough to see through the window. And we get like maybe half a second before the camera switches to the window, and we see Dorothy and Blanche kind of slowly standing up and looking in the window. And it was delightful, very funny. And Jean's face at that time as well was really happy. She had this great expression. I think everything turned out right. And it's a really lovely episode. I think they handled the topic very, very well. I'm very impressed, but not surprised. Because, as I said, the show seems to tackle a lot of issues that, for the time, were maybe not always done sensitively, or that there are other shows that don't handle particularly gay characters. They don't necessarily handle it very well from around this time, and they did a phenomenal job with it, and I'm rather impressed. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. Very funny, but also sensitive when it needs to be. Isn't it romantic? Is a really delightful episode.